Today, we're going to talk about why the jumpy behind the behaviors we're experiencing first. After that, we'll talk about preventing and management. And then we'll spend the bulk of the presentation today discussing how to solve this problem. As a reminder, jot down any questions that come up throughout this presentation, as you will be invited to a live session after this, in which you will have the opportunity to ask any questions you may have directly to one of our trainers.
So, why does jumpy behavior happen? It starts at the very beginning as they're puppies. They jump on their mom for interaction. It's a way to get her to lay down and feed them. It's a way for her to provide them with what they need, right? So, in the very earliest stages of dogs' lives, they're learning how to jump. And then, at some point, there begins to be interactions with humans. They start to put their paws on us, and it's so cute. And they're so little, and we tend to ooh and ah over them. And guess what? We've just reinforced that behavior. The dogs quickly figure out that this is a way that they can communicate with us. At the most basic level, jumping is a way for the dog to get something they want or need from us and even other animals. Jumping can also be a way for them to stop something from happening or a way to express themselves when they're feeling stressed and don't know how else to express those emotions. So, jumping, big picture, is a signal. It's a way for dogs to communicate with us. So let's look at some different types of jumping.
We like to divide things up into emotional based behaviors and non emotional ones. There absolutely can be an overlap in the emotional and non emotional reasons for jumping, but the reason we like to think of them in these two buckets is because if we have jumping that is based on an emotion, or in other words, is a manifestation of what that dog is feeling, we can't solve that problem if we don't address the emotion first. So let's quickly take a look at those two buckets.
We're going to start by identifying some types of non emotional jumping. You might hear people refer to this as attention jumping. Remember, attention seeking jumping is a way for dogs to express themselves. It's a way to let us know what they want. You can see in this lovely picture here of one of my old colleagues and this giant dog jumping on her. Yes, they were having fun, but jumping on things can be annoying and it can also be dangerous. So we want to take that into account. Non emotional jumping can look like this. It can look like jumping on kennel bars, and it can look like jumping on other things around the shelter. It's also worth just mentioning here that nipping can very much fall into this attention seeking category, and we see it often go hand in hand with jumpy behavior.
Emotional jumping is going to look like excitement about greetings, height seeking, and anxiety or fear driven jumping. Again, there can be overlap in the emotional and non emotional jumping in the shelter. We're going to talk about each of these emotion driven jumping styles in a little bit. When we talk about excitement jumping, these are generally greetings where they're jumping up on the person and they may be exhibiting barking and other happy body language. They're jumping because they're anticipating something that they're excited about happening. This is generally a person, which is why we sometimes call this a greeting jumping, but this can also be because they see a leash and know they're going on a walk or to playgroup and are excited about that, or maybe it's even a food bowl and they're excited for mealtime. Another emotion-based form of jumping is height seeking and or distance increasing. The dogs are jumping because they're uncomfortable, they're nervous, or they're a little worried about something and they're trying to tell us that they need some space. They're essentially trying to tell whatever is bothering them, hey, I need you to back up and I need a little space. Lastly, we also have jumping that can be a form of anxiety, fear, or arousal. The dog is overstimulated. This type of jumping tends to be unpredictable, but it happens when the dogs are experiencing stress due to fear or anxiety. It's generally triggered by something in their environment or changes in that environment. This is extremely common in the shelter. Just think of all those environmental stressors. The jumping is very repetitive, it's very intense, and it's really about that dog asking for help. I'm guessing this is a very common experience in your shelter and is a big part of why you're here today.
Before we can dive in and start building plans for these dogs, we want to take a look a little bit at things we can do to prevent the problem when possible in the first place. We understand that in the shelter environment, this is sometimes easier said than done when you have staff, volunteers, and potential adopters roaming your halls. But take from this what you can. So, to start, what we don't want to do is encouraging jumping from the get go. Even those cute little puppies. Not all puppies are going to be 5 or 6 pounds forever. Some of them grow into very large dogs, like the one you saw jumping on my old colleague a couple slides ago. If we reinforce that cute jumping as a puppy, it can be problematic for us once they're adults. This can also be true when a dog first enters the shelter, a foster, or an adoptive home. People's intentions are good. They're trying to build a bond or a connection with the dog, but this is something we don't want to encourage. If it does happen, we want to interrupt it quickly, and this can be as simple as turning away from the dog, tossing treats away from you, or removing yourself from the space. If you know that a dog knows cues, such as sit, you can also ask them for that. Really, any behavior that they know and that is incompatible with jumping will do. And most of the time, we're not going to know what, if any, cues the dog knows, which is why, when necessary, you may just need to remove yourself. It's important to remember that dogs do not generalize well, so we need everyone on the same page as much as possible. Again, we understand how challenging this can be in the shelter environment, but do your best. Sometimes signage on the kennel can be really helpful here.
As part of prevention and management, we also need to be thinking about enrichment. Mental stimulation is going to be very important for these dogs. If we provide good mental stimulation, that can be an outlet for their brains. Again, we can do an entire talk on this, but a simple Google search for dog enrichment or even something like DIY dog enrichment should yield plenty of ideas for you. Physical exercise is important too. We certainly don't want our dogs finding ways to get their exercise in, like jumping. Structure and routine, which are both things we talk about more in depth in our Foundations of Shelter Behavior course, is going to be very important when establishing patterns and predictability for these dogs so they understand how to communicate in specific situations. What we don't want is for them to be left to their own devices, in this instance, jumping, as a way to communicate.
In addition to daily mental and physical enrichment, we want to try to minimize and identify any triggers when we're talking about preventing and managing jumping. By eliminating triggers whenever possible, we're eliminating the opportunity for the dog to practice the jumpy behavior. This could look like hanging blankets or other visual barriers during high stress times of day, doing a treat scatter prior to leashing the dog. Maybe it's asking volunteers to walk this dog first, or not approach the kennel with a leash in hand. It really depends on what you've identified as the trigger, and if there are creative ways you can eliminate it so the dog doesn't have a reason to practice the jumping as much. Minimizing triggers can be both environment, such as the barriers, or behavioral, as in your behavior. Think about what you are doing and if there are things you can adjust to reduce the chances of the dog jumping.
And lastly, training. We can teach alternative behaviors like sit, place, or four on the floor for the attention seeking dogs. And then for the emotion driven jumping, if we think that there's an emotional component, we're going to need to consider incorporating some desensitization and counter conditioning. We're going to talk more about that in depth in just a little minute. Before we dive in a little deeper here, we want to just throw out a couple of additional ideas that can be implemented with virtually any dog, such as calming pheromones, using calm voices when greeting, and playing calming music.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at desensitization and counter conditioning. I think everything up until this point is pretty basic and things you are likely already doing or have done in the past. Desensitization and counter conditioning are both crucial tools for dogs that are jumpy for emotion driven reasons. Desensitization involves gradually exposing an animal to a stimulus, such as loud noises, unfamiliar people, or handling in a controlled and positive manner, starting at a level where the animal feels comfortable and gradually increasing exposure as they become more accustomed to it. Obviously, in the shelter, this is extremely challenging, but we wanted to provide you with the way this ideally works for you so you have it in mind. This process helps reduce the fear response associated with the stimulus over time. Counter conditioning, on the other hand, involves pairing the feared stimulus with something the dog enjoys, such as treats or play, to create a positive association. By consistently pairing the feared stimulus with something pleasurable, the animal learns to associate the stimulus with positive experiences, leading to a change in their emotional response. Together, desensitization and counter conditioning can help build the dog's confidence, reduce stress, and hopefully be a tool in decreasing their jumpy behavior. What might this look like for a jumpy dog in the shelter? It can be as simple as having volunteers calmly walk through the kennels and drop treats for any dogs that have 4 feet on the floor. Once the dog you are focused on is starting to reliably sit or stand at the front of the kennel, you can up the criteria and have the volunteer pause in front of the kennel and start to build duration. Giving the dog a treat after 1 second of calm, then 2 seconds of calm, and then 3 seconds of calm. Once the dog can reliably handle a person approaching and standing in front of their kennel without jumping, you can up the criteria again and have the volunteer reach towards the kennel door, then deliver a treat, then tap the latch and then deliver a treat, then unlatch the door and treat, and so on. You are starting to counter condition their emotional response to the human approaching and desensitizing them to exciting things like a human approaching, touching their kennel, and taking them out. And this doesn't have to happen exclusively when the dog is in the kennel. You can also practice having people approach the dog when they are out of their kennel, whether that's on leash or in a yard.
In addition to teaching simple exercises such as the one Jenny just mentioned, you can also focus on teaching a desired behavior that, wouldn't you know it, is incompatible with jumping. Teaching incompatible behaviors are an excellent way to address jumpy behavior in addition to all of the management and other environmental changes we've already discussed. So, what are some other behaviors or cues that you can teach the dog that are incompatible with jumping? Sit, down, and place are all excellent options. You can also teach touch, as this is a game you can play through kennel bars if safety is a concern, but it still allows the dog to get some social interaction with people, to get some movement, and most importantly, to use their brain some. Additionally, foraging for treats via a treat scatter is another incompatible behavior that really requires no teaching on your part and truly anyone can do.
In addition to desensitization, counter conditioning, and teaching incompatible behaviors, another great thing to work with your jumpy dog on is impulse control. One of the simplest ways to do this is to teach them sit and then build the duration of the time that they hold this sit. You can also begin to ask them for a sit before leashing, before crossing thresholds, before delivering food, etc. Anything that gives them an opportunity to practice slowing down a little and using their brain is great for these jumpy kids. Earlier in the talk, we mentioned creating a pattern or protocol for staff and volunteers when they're interacting with a jumpy dog whose behavior you're working to modify. Having these protocols clearly written and posted can be crucial for keeping everyone on the same page, which in turn is crucial for helping the dog to succeed. As part of this training, you'll receive a sample protocol for leashing a jumpy dog. Feel free to use this as it is or modify it for your specific needs.
Something we haven't talked much about up until this point is dogs that are jumpy due to overarousal or overstimulation or even due to frustration. This is most commonly seen with leash reactivity, but may also occur due to reactivity to a dog in a neighboring kennel. This type of jumping often tends to occur along with mouthing or nipping. The dogs may be jumping due to fear or anxiety, or in the case of leash reactivity, because they feel restricted and or like they have nowhere to go. So, what are some tools for this type of jumping? Offering them a toy to carry can be really helpful for some dogs. Scattering treats and or simply turning in a different direction when a trigger is present also work. It's important to remember that jumping can truly be an expression of an underlying emotional component. Prevention and not allowing the dog to practice the jumping is just as important as how we deal with the jumping when it does occur. This may mean that sometimes you have to pause walking the dog so that they don't get the opportunity to practice the jumping until you are able to get some of the other skills we've discussed on board for them. Hopefully, as soon as you heard us say this, you thought to yourself, if we're pausing walks, we better increase enrichment. And if you didn't have that thought, no worries, jot it down right now. Once you are ready to get the dog back out there, if possible, start with some nice decompression walks. These are walks where there is lots to sniff and ideally no other dogs around to incite those high levels of arousal or stimulation.
If you have access to a stuffed dog or a very mellow helper type dog, you can also work on some desensitization and counter conditioning when you're ready to start resuming walking the dog. Remember, for this to be effective, you have to start at a distance that is below the dog's threshold, meaning they see the other dog, stuffed or alive, and don't react. You treat, 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 and move away, slowly working on decreasing the distance between you and the other dog without your dog reacting. You could also consider something like look at that, in which case you are under the dog's threshold around a trigger. And when the dog looks at the trigger and then looks back at you without reacting, you reinforce that behavior by giving them a reward. This is called response substitution. They learn that by calmly looking at you, they get a treat, rather than jumping, which does not result in anything awesome like a treat.
We've talked a lot up until this point about what you can do with a dog. To finish things out, we want to make sure we quickly discuss things you should not do. It's very understandable that many times when a dog is jumping up on someone, the first reaction is to yell off or something similar at the dog, or to even try and jerk them down by the leash. Some people will also either push the dog away or maybe even knee at it. All of these different things add to the dog's arousal and or their frustration. At the end of the day, these are still giving the dog interaction with us, which is likely what they're seeking. So, while we know it's often your instinct to do one or a combination of these things, please do try to avoid them as much as possible.
At the end of the day, while jumping is a far less than desirable behavior, it is still a natural behavior for dogs. But we know it can not only be annoying or even painful for staff and volunteers, it can be a huge turnoff for potential adopters, just like digging and chewing and barking are. You know what's not natural though? The shelter environment. It's smelly, it's loud, it's packed with strange people coming and going, and nothing about it is natural for our dogs. We hope you'll keep that tucked in the back of your mind as you work to utilize these tools we've discussed today and implement them in your own facility.
We hope that you've learned a lot from this recording, and we look forward to seeing you at the live training session. Make sure to bring those questions with you, but if you have anything that simply can't wait until then, please feel free to send us an email at shelters@goodpup.com. We look forward to seeing you all at the live session.